Is drinking too much water leading to obesity in our youth? And British scientists have successfully cloned a dinosaur. What does this mean for our future?
Also, one man attempts to break a world record. But first, is our dependence on foreign oil too strong? And if so, what can we do to stop it? I'm Linda Reed.
And I'm Rose Hawthorne. This is Action 2 News at 10. Since 2009, the price per barrel of crude oil has doubled from $54 to $108, leaving Americans speechless at the pump. Not only does the price of oil have an effect on the wallets of Americans, it negatively impacts the earth. These fossil fuels are attributed to greenhouse gases, which contribute to the global warming and its subsequent effects. However, while some consider it a pest, there is an organism that might actually help with high gas prices, and is in fact environmentally friendly: algae.
Algae are small, plant-like photosynthetic organisms that live in the water and use sunlight, carbon dioxide, water, and nutrients to produce energy and oxygen. Because they grow in large numbers and manufacture oils that can be converted into fuel, they represent a possible source of energy that may help meet the growing worldwide demand. Algae are ultimately beneficial to the environment because they would prevent and reduce the effects of global warming. There are multiple ways to convert microalgae or macroalgae, those small enough to individually require a microscope to be seen, and those large enough to be seen with the naked eye respectively, into evenly energy through different biochemical and thermochemical conversion processes. Some of the biochemical conversion include fermentation and anaerobic digestion of the biomass to yield bioethanol or methane. As a thermochemical, there is gasification, pyrolysis, hydrogenation, and liquefaction. Today we'll be focusing on liquefaction.
Unlike fossil fuels derived from crude oil, biofuels are organic sources of energy that replenish naturally and quickly. Algae produce cellular oils that can be refined into different biofuels, including jet and diesel fuels that can be used without the need for engine modifications. Algae also produce sugars useful for making fuels like butanol and ethanol. For more on this topic, we turn to our reporter in the field, Ivy Gardner.
Ivy?
Gasoline out of liquefied algae. That's the future Dr. Basil Burnett, a professor of biochemical engineering, and a team of fellow engineers at the University of Wisconsin are creating. Algae have long been attractive as a source of renewable fuel, and the subject of a number of associated studies as early as the late 1970s. But what is it that makes algal biofuels such a promising alternative? For one thing, they live in water. All the other biofuel feedstocks, as they're called, are land-based, and a huge hindrance to making enough biofuel is that there's just not enough spare land. Algae are mainly aquatic and can live in both marine and freshwater environments. Some that are made into fuel are cultivated in closed and open ponds, and there are advantages and disadvantages to each. Closed systems are expensive because of the challenges in operation and due to the limited resources available in a closed system. However, growing algae in open ponds is risky because one has to take into consideration that there can be contamination. Algae also have to be cultivated at the right temperature. Beyond this, algae don't even require good water. In fact, they could be grown on treated sewage using the waste as their nutrients. Modern science also allows for algae to be bred or genetically engineered for increased lipid accumulation and photosynthetic efficiency. Such a selective use of a variety of species could allow for widespread and large-scale production, as well as limit the overall costs. Another benefit is that algae are naturally voracious growers, as anyone who's ever owned a fish tank can tell you. In scientific terms, that's because they're so efficient at converting sunlight into biomass, much more so than land plants. Professor?
Well, typically in America, we make biodiesel out of soybeans, and we get something around the order of 50 gallons of biodiesel per acre per year from soy. With algae, the estimate range wildly, but you can get anywhere from between 1,000 to 5,000 gallons of bio-oil per acre per year. But with algae, we can become more sustainable because algae can be grown in areas where there does not need to be much water. Therefore, We don't have to worry about using land that crops will need to grow on because algae can be produced anywhere.
This productivity is already being exploited. Companies and labs have sprouted up around the country working on developing algal fuels. But what they're trying to make almost exclusively is algal biodiesel. And if biodiesel is like squeezing the juice out of an apple, what Burnett's lab hopes to do is put the whole apple into a blender. As you may have already guessed, I'm here with Dr. Burnett and lead engineer of Verbena plant in the lab. What can you tell me about your process and the differences between it and the production of biodiesel?
Well, the first difference is that we fill tiny metal cylinders and squirt of algae in water. Conventional biodiesel requires the algae to be dried, which takes a huge amount of energy. That drying process is the biggest hurdle to making algae fuel cheap enough to replace petroleum. In our experiment, however, we intend to use water to our advantage. So once we load a reactor, we then seal it and react it in hot sand bath for about an hour typically.
A hot sand bath is actually an understatement. It's nearly 3 times boiling temperature, but because the mixture is under lots of pressure, it doesn't boil. Instead, it drives chemical reactions in the algae that break down all the cell's components.
And that's the second big difference from biodiesel. It's using all the cell's components for biodiesel you'd extract just from the oil of the algae, but then leaves behind the other stuff in the cell, like sugars and proteins, which we can use. With the biodiesel process, people are excited if they have an algae that's 50% oil, but then right away they're only using 50% of the mass, or the biomass. With our approach, we'd like to be able to liquefy, 100%.
So what comes out of the superheated reactor is gasoline?
Well, it's not quite gasoline, more like crude oil we drill out of the ground now. It still needs refining. It shouldn't be surprising, though, that algae under lots of heat and pressure becomes similar to crude oil. In fact, that's precisely the way petroleum crude oil was formed long ago.
So we're trying to do in the lab what nature took millions of years to accomplish. And the end product to the naked eye looks, well, like gasoline.
These samples are of some of the different types of crude bio that we've made from the algae, and we can get oil with different characteristics depending on how we process it.
So different growing and processing conditions get different results.
It's just one of the knobs that we as engineers have to turn. It's how we do the processing that influences the product that we get out.
Once Burnett's lab is done turning knobs, his colleague takes over. The two main outputs, the bio-oil and the content filtered off, head in different directions. The bio-oil goes to the chemical engineer's lab. This is the refinery step. This is what turns crude oil, bio-oil into algal gasoline. Here, researchers are working on building molecules called catalysts, which will
Rearrange these molecules that are part of this algae bio-oil in a way that they resemble something that can be used in a combustion engine.
This is the step that will transform test tubes of oil into gasoline as we know it today.
So what you really want to do is you want to go from these large molecules that nature has created in the form of this algae, and you want to change its composition in a very selective way to obtain something that's useful with the least possible amount of energy loss.
Conserving energy is the main focus of the lab, which will process all the bio-oil content, the waste basically. But the waste is still rich in carbon, and carbon equals energy.
So essentially what my group is doing is to help harness the power of microbes to do some biological upgrade and recycling.
The philosophy?
Squeeze every carbon possible.
They'll be genetically modifying microbes like E. coli to digest the waste. Ideally, the waste will also be converted into usable fuel. It's just one more way to close the loop, as these researchers say, to minimize energy input and reduce carbon emissions. It's the environmental engineer's job to judge, in the end, how successful they are.
As engineers working on technology, we're sometimes very, focused on a particular process and trying to optimize it. It's the environmental engineer's job to take the helicopter view of the entire system to see how impacts are distributed and to try and come up with an idea of an overall carbon footprint.
The environmental engineer will tally up all the resources, like energy, water, and the land that go into the fuel. Those can then be compared to petroleum and to other biofuels to see, in the end, just how green algal gasoline is. He'll put every step of the process into his computer models, from growing the algae to refining the oil to recycling the waste carbons. As for the economics, most recent studies suggest that while algal growth and eventual production can be expensive, current subsidies and policies in place may allow for open pond systems versus closed systems to turn a healthy profit. Cruising someday, hopefully, on just a tank of algae and a smile, I'm reporter Ivy Gardner for Channel 2 News, Madison, Wisconsin.
Thank you, Ivy. We will now cut over to Aspen Rush for our do-it-yourself section. Well, Aspen, what do you have for us today?
Sticking with the biofuel theme for the day, I'm going to be showing you how you can grow algae yourself, right out of your home. First things first, you're going to need something to grow it out of. This can be anything from an old milk carton, a bin, or anything that's just lying around the house. I'm cutting off the top so we can actually access the algae from it. Now you're going to grow a large amount of algae because even though the average laboratory is striving for 70% efficiency, the homemade method is only for about 40% efficiency. You're going to add your algae strain, even though you might not have algae laying around the house. You can order some online, collect it from your local lake or whatever. I would recommend ordering it online just so you can get a good strain and make sure it's efficient. Then you're going to add water so it can grow in. Pretty simple step. You're going to also need to add fertilizer to the water so it can produce the most efficient algae, which we're doing here. You're going to want fertilizer that's heavy in nitrogen and phosphorus for the best results. We need algae to be in optimal conditions because the lipids will be squeezing out of the algae stored fat, so the more glutinous we make our algae, the more fuel we will get out of it. Now we just let the algae sit in sunlight. We stir it once a day to make sure it keeps growing in optimal conditions. And once our algae is grown, we'll remove about 90%, and the remaining 10% will be used to produce more algae and let it continue to grow. We don't want the algae for surviving too long in just the stored lipids. Once the algae are dry, we need to press it and squeeze the lipids out. Here, really, anything works as long as we are squeezing out the lipids. I'll be using a hand press for the situation. We also already previously got the dried algae since it would kind of take a while to do so, which you can see. And then, yeah, you would press it, as you can see. Now that we have all the lipids out, which is right here, we can remove the oxygen from the oil to change crude oil to gasoline. There's no household product that does this. You would need phosphoric or citric acid and sodium hydroxide. First, you would add a small amount of phosphoric or citric acid. This will convert the remaining non-hydratable phospholipids into hydratable phospholipids. If you are not making this on an overly large scale, a few drops will do. Then you add hydroxide solution. The last step is to add water. The gasoline will rise to the top and the water will pull out all the water-soluble materials that we don't want. Then pour the mixture into a narrow container and scoop off the top. And now you have gasoline ready to run your car and get to work. Back to you, Rose.
Thank you, Aspen. In a 2010 study, it was estimated that a barrel of algae biofuel would cost between $240 and $332 compared to its competitor, crude oil, at $92 a barrel. This high cost is the main reason why algae biofuel production isn't at full capacity yet. There are currently over 30 companies in the U.S. alone working to reduce the cost of this mass production to replace crude oil.
We're going to take a quick commercial break, but when we come back, are Smurfs real? How does this affect you? The answers may surprise you.